The moment the cathedral doors opened, every camera in the room tilted at once like they had been waiting for a single breath to break the silence. The air inside the grand Holloway ballroom felt too polished to be real, too perfect to trust, with white orchids climbing along crystal stands, chandeliers casting a soft gold glow over rows of guests seated in curated silence, and a string quartet holding a note so delicate it seemed to suspend time itself as Claire Bennett stepped inside, wearing a gown that looked less like fabric and more like a decision she had already survived before arriving. Her steps were slow, measured, each one echoing faintly against marble floors that reflected her silhouette like a second version of herself walking slightly behind. And though every face turned toward her, what struck her first was not admiration or warmth, but the absence of it, a subtle, almost imperceptible stillness that did not belong in a room meant for celebration. At the end of the aisle stood Ethan Whitmore, CEO of Whitmore Enterprises, a man whose name carried weight in boardrooms across the country, a man known for closing deals without raising his voice, for rewriting markets with nothing more than a signature and a glance. And yet today, he stood motionless, hands folded in front of him, eyes fixed not on her arrival, but somewhere beyond it, as though the moment itself had already been decided without her input. Claire tightened her grip on the small bouquet in her hands, not because she was nervous in the way people assumed brides to be, but because something about the atmosphere felt engineered, as if every detail of this wedding had been arranged not for union, but for observation, like a stage where the audience already knew the ending before the actors had spoken a single line. Behind her, whispers began to form in soft clusters, names passing between guests like currency, references to contracts, to business mergers disguised as romance, to a marriage that had been spoken of more in financial circles than in intimate ones. And Claire heard enough of it to understand that she was not stepping into a beginning, but into a continuation of something already in motion long before she agreed to wear white. As she reached the midpoint of the aisle, Ethan still had not moved, not even in acknowledgement, and that absence of gesture began to echo louder than any greeting could have, spreading through the room like an unspoken signal that the ceremony they were here to witness might not unfold as expected. A faint tension gathered near the front rows where members of both families sat arranged in careful symmetry. But even they seemed unsure whether to smile or remain still, their expressions suspended somewhere between celebration and caution, as though they too had signed something they did not fully understand. Claire's gaze lifted briefly toward Ethan, searching for something familiar, something grounding, but found only composure so controlled it felt almost detached from emotion entirely. And in that instant she became aware of a truth she had not allowed herself to name before today, that this union was not built on spontaneity or even romance, but on structure, obligation, and agreements that extended far beyond the visible ceremony. When she finally reached the altar space, the music softened in a way that felt less like transition and more like withdrawal, as if even the instruments were stepping back to observe what would happen next, and still Ethan did not reach for her hand, did not step forward, did not acknowledge her arrival in the way every guest had been conditioned to expect. Instead, he looked briefly toward the officiant, then toward the room filled with investors, executives, and media affiliates who had been invited under the guise of a private celebration, but clearly understood the public nature of everything unfolding here. And Claire felt the weight of that realization settle quietly in her chest, not as panic, but as clarity sharpening slowly into focus. Somewhere behind her, a phone camera clicked, then another, subtle at first, then increasing, not because anything dramatic had happened, but because anticipation itself had become the event, and people had begun to sense that this wedding might not proceed along the script they had been given. Ethan finally spoke, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a calm precision that caused the nearest conversations to fade mid-sentence, his voice carrying just enough to reach the edges of the room without effort. And though his words were simple, they carried a structural weight that made them feel final before they were fully understood. Claire did not respond immediately, her posture remaining steady, her expression controlled, because something in the rhythm of the room had shifted into a space where reactions were being measured rather than expressed, and she could feel the attention of every person present tightening around her like a narrowing frame. A faint rustle moved through the guests as if a collective breath had been held too long, and even the chandelier light above seemed to hold still for a fraction of a second that no one could properly account for. And in that suspended moment, Claire understood that whatever came next would not be personal in the way private conversations are personal, but public, structured, and irreversible in its visibility. Ethan's gaze returned to her again, sharper now, not unkind, but undeniably distant. And Claire realized with unsettling clarity that the man standing before her was not someone stepping into a marriage, but someone standing at the center of a decision already calculated elsewhere. And she found herself no longer anticipating a ceremony, but waiting for the first fracture in the illusion everyone else had agreed to maintain. The silence that followed felt engineered rather than natural, as though the entire ballroom had collectively agreed to hold its breath in anticipation of a moment that had already been delayed too long. And Claire Bennett remained still at the edge of the altar space, her bouquet now feeling less like a symbol of celebration and more like a fragile object that no longer belonged in her hands, while Ethan Whitmore stood across from her with an expression that revealed nothing beyond careful control, the kind of composure that did not invite interpretation because it had been trained not to allow it. For a few seconds that stretched far longer than anyone was comfortable admitting, nothing moved except the subtle shift of camera lenses, adjusting focus. And then Ethan finally turned his head slightly toward the side of the room where a man in a dark suit had been waiting near the edge of the seating arrangement, unnoticed until now, holding a thin black folder that seemed out of place in a ceremony built on aesthetic perfection. The man stepped forward without urgency, his movements measured, deliberate, as though he had been rehearsing this walk in his mind long before arriving, and the sound of his shoes against the marble floor cut through the stillness with a clarity that made several guests instinctively turn their attention in unison. Claire's gaze followed the motion, her expression unchanged but her awareness sharpening, because she understood instantly that whatever was about to enter this moment did not belong to tradition or ceremony, but to structure, documentation, and something far more binding than spoken vows. The officiant hesitated, glancing between Ethan and the approaching man, as if waiting for confirmation that this interruption was part of the plan, but no one offered reassurance, and that absence alone shifted the energy of the room into something more uncertain. When the man reached the center space, he stopped just short of the altar, opened the folder, and withdrew a single document that looked unremarkable at first glance, yet carried a weight that seemed to alter the temperature of the air around it. Ethan's eyes lowered briefly toward the paper, then returned to Claire, and for the first time since she had entered the ballroom, there was a faint indication of something behind his composure that could not be immediately categorized, not emotion exactly, but recognition of consequence. The man holding the document spoke in a calm, professional tone, introducing nothing dramatic, only stating that what he was about to read was part of a previously executed agreement between both parties. And at the mention of the word agreement, several guests exchanged glances that confirmed their suspicion that this marriage had always been more contractual than ceremonial. Claire did not react outwardly, but something inside her shifted slightly, not in fear, but in alignment, as if a set of fragmented details she had been observing since entering the room had suddenly begun forming a coherent pattern. Ethan extended his hand without speaking, and the document was placed into it with careful precision, and the act itself felt ceremonial in a way that contrasted sharply with the wedding setting, as though the true ritual of the day had just begun only now. As Ethan unfolded the paper, the room tightened again, not with sound but with focus, every guest leaning into a collective expectation that something irreversible was about to be acknowledged aloud. His eyes moved across the first line slowly, and for a moment there was no visible change in his expression, only concentration, but then a subtle shift occurred, almost imperceptible, like a recalibration of understanding that did not yet have words attached to it. Claire watched him closely, not searching for weakness, but for truth, because she could sense that whatever was written there was not meant to surprise her alone, but to redefine the structure of everything surrounding them. The officiant took a half step back, sensing that authority in the room had temporarily shifted away from ceremony and into something more procedural, more binding, and the guests who had once been restless now stood completely still, Their attention locked onto the unfolding document as though it had replaced the altar itself as the center of gravity. Ethan turned a page, and this time his jaw tightened slightly, not in anger but in recognition of specificity, as if the language he was reading was not new to him in concept but newly revealed in consequence. And the absence of immediate reaction from Claire only deepened the tension, because she remained exactly as she had been since entering, composed, observant, and unwilling to fill the silence with assumptions. The man who had delivered the document stepped back into the edge of the space, blending once again into the background, leaving Ethan alone with the text and the entire room suspended in anticipation of interpretation. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower than before, not louder but heavier, as though the words required more effort to release than anything he had said previously, and the first sentence alone caused a subtle ripple through the audience as understanding began to spread in fragments. Several guests shifted in their seats, some leaning forward, others glancing at each other as if verifying whether they had heard correctly, and the earlier assumption that this was a routine ceremony dissolved completely into something far more complex. Claire's attention remained fixed on Ethan, and for the first time she saw a fracture in the controlled surface he had maintained since her arrival, not dramatic but structural, like the early lines of stress forming in glass under pressure that had not yet reached its breaking point. As he continued reading, the atmosphere of the room transformed from expectation to absorption, every detail now filtered through the realization that this document was not supplementary to the ceremony, but foundational to it, and that what had been presented as a union was in fact a transaction layered with conditions that were only now being fully acknowledged in public view. A faint murmur began to rise, and then quickly faded as people corrected themselves back into silence, aware that even speculation felt inappropriate in a moment so precise and exposed. And Claire finally shifted her weight slightly, not out of discomfort, but out of clarity, as if the final piece of a hidden structure had just clicked into place within her understanding. Ethan reached the final section of the document and paused, his eyes lingering longer than before, and in that pause the entire room seemed to contract inward, waiting not for drama but for consequence, because everyone present understood instinctively that what would follow next would not be ceremonial language but acknowledgement of something irreversible already in motion beneath the surface of everything they had been watching. He lowered the paper slightly, his gaze lifting toward Claire once more, and for the first time since the ceremony began, neither of them appeared to be standing within the expectations of the room anymore, but instead at the edge of a truth that had finally reached the point where it could no longer remain unspoken. The room did not move at first, as if even the air itself was waiting for permission to continue, and Ethan Whitmore stood at the center of that suspended silence holding the document slightly lower now, his eyes still tracking the final lines as though they refused to align with what he already understood instinctively. Claire Bennett remained exactly where she had been since the beginning of the reading, her posture unchanged, her expression steady, but something in her stillness had shifted from anticipation to confirmation, as if she was no longer waiting for revelation, but witnessing recognition unfold in real time. Ethan's voice, when it returned, was quieter than before, stripped of the earlier ceremonial tone and replaced with something more measured, more procedural, as though he had stepped out of the role of groom entirely and into the role of interpreter of consequences. The first few words he spoke were enough to change the atmosphere again, not with volume, but with specificity, because what he was reading was no longer abstract agreement language, but structured clauses tied directly to ownership, responsibility, and conditional control. A faint rustle moved through the audience as people adjusted their understanding, some leaning forward slightly, while others instinctively looked away, as if recognizing that they were witnessing something that had never been meant for public interpretation. Claire's gaze did not waver, and in that unwavering focus, there was a quiet clarity that contrasted sharply with the shifting energy of the room, because she had already understood far more than she had spoken, and what remained now was not discovery, but acknowledgement. Ethan turned another page, and the motion itself felt heavier than before, as if the paper had accumulated meaning with every second it remained in his hands, and when he paused again his jaw tightened subtly, not in anger but in recalibration, the kind that occurs when assumptions are replaced by documented certainty. The man who had delivered the folder stood at a respectful distance, hands folded in front of him, maintaining professional detachment, but even he had lowered his gaze slightly, no longer observing the room, but waiting for the inevitable structural shift that always follows when hidden terms become visible in shared space. Ethan continued reading, and this time the words he spoke carried a different weight entirely, referencing conditions tied to timing, asset allocation, and legal thresholds that redefined what the audience had assumed this ceremony represented. A soft murmur rose and disappeared almost immediately, not because people did not understand, but because they did, and understanding created a kind of collective restraint that replaced curiosity with silence. Claire finally shifted her eyes slightly, not toward Ethan directly, but toward the document itself. And in that brief glance there was no surprise, only confirmation that what was being read aloud had already existed beneath the surface of everything leading up to this moment. The orchestra had long since stopped playing, and now even the ambient sounds of movement within the ballroom seemed to have withdrawn, leaving only the voice of Ethan Whitmore as the central axis of the room. He reached a section that caused him to pause longer than before, his finger holding the edge of the page as though preventing it from turning prematurely. And when he spoke again, his tone had lost the last remnants of ceremonial structure entirely, replaced by clarity so precise it felt almost detached. Several guests exchanged subtle glances, recognizing that the language being read no longer belonged to romance or celebration but to governance, agreement, and consequence. And the realization settled over them gradually, like weight distributed across a surface that could no longer ignore it. Claire's hands remained still at her sides, the bouquet now entirely forgotten, and she did not attempt to interpret Ethan's reaction, because what mattered was not his interpretation of the document, but the existence of the document itself and what it represented in structural terms. Ethan turned another page and stopped again, longer this time, and when he finally continued there was a noticeable shift in the room's collective attention, as if every person present had begun to understand that they were no longer observers of a ceremony, but witnesses to a contractual unveiling that extended far beyond the walls of the ballroom. The clause he read aloud referenced conditions tied to public representation and private authority, outlining terms that subtly redefined decision-making power in ways that were not immediately emotional, but structurally absolute. And as each word entered the space, it seemed to reduce the remaining illusion of spontaneity that had surrounded the event. Claire's expression remained composed, but there was a subtle realignment in her posture, not defensive, not reactive, but grounded, as if she had stepped fully into an understanding of what this moment had been building toward long before she arrived. Ethan's voice slowed slightly as he reached the final portion of the document, and the pause between sentences became more pronounced, creating intervals of silence that felt heavier than the words themselves. The audience did not move, did not speak, did not even shift noticeably, because the structure of attention had collapsed into a single point centered on the paper in Ethan's hands. When he finally reached the concluding clause, he stopped entirely, holding the page without turning it. And for a brief moment there was no sound in the entire ballroom, not even the subtle rustle of clothing or the distant clink of glassware that had defined the earlier atmosphere. Claire looked directly at him now, and in that exchange there was no performance, no expectation, only alignment of understanding between two people standing on opposite sides of a document that had quietly rewritten the meaning of everything that had brought them into this room. Ethan lowered the paper slightly, his gaze lifting toward the audience before returning to her, and for the first time since the ceremony began, the structure of authority within the room did not rest with the officiant, the guests, or the tradition itself, but with the quiet, undeniable weight of what had just been acknowledged aloud. The silence that followed was not empty, but full, as though every person present had finally recognized that the event they had gathered to witness was not unfolding in real time, but revealing itself layer by layer according to terms that had already been established elsewhere. And Claire Bennett remained at the center of it all, not as a participant in confusion, but as the calm point around which the entire meaning of the moment had begun to reorganize itself. The silence in the ballroom did not break immediately after Ethan Whitmore lowered the document. Instead, it deepened in a way that made the entire space feel structurally different, as though the room itself had shifted from celebration to observation, without anyone noticing the exact moment it happened. And Claire Bennett remained at the center of it all with a calm that no longer felt passive but intentional. Because what had just been spoken aloud was no longer theory or implication but confirmed structure written in legally binding language that redefined every assumption the room had been carrying since the ceremony began. Ethan's eyes moved once more across the final lines, slower now, not because he did not understand them, but because understanding had begun to carry consequences that required time to fully process. And when he finally exhaled, it was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet enough to signal that something beneath his control had shifted. The man in the dark suit who had delivered the folder took a small step back again, returning fully into the background as though his role had ended the moment the document stopped being private, and the guests who had once been composed in elegant stillness now held themselves in a different kind of restraint, one that came from awareness rather than etiquette. Claire's gaze remained steady on Ethan, not searching for approval or reaction, but waiting for recognition to complete its circuit, because she had already reached the point where interpretation was no longer necessary for her. Only acknowledgement from the other side mattered now. Ethan finally spoke again, and this time his voice carried a different weight entirely. Not the controlled authority of a CEO addressing a room, not the ceremonial tone of a groom at an altar, but the measured precision of someone translating legal consequence into spoken reality for everyone present to hear. As he continued, fragments of the document began to take shape in the room's collective understanding, references to governance structures, conditional authority, and predefined limitations tied to performance within the marriage contract that no longer resembled anything romantic or symbolic, but instead functioned like a framework for operational control between two entities that had been presented as partners. A faint shift passed through the audience as individuals began to realize that what they were witnessing was not a disruption of a wedding, but the public unveiling of a system that had existed long before today, carefully constructed and only now exposed under controlled conditions. Claire did not move, yet her stillness had changed meaning, because it no longer read as uncertainty or emotional restraint, but as confirmation that she had never been outside this structure, only waiting for it to be revealed in its entirety. Ethan turned another page, and for the first time since the document had entered his hands, there was hesitation in the motion itself, not because of doubt in the words, but because of what the words now implied about his own position within the arrangement. The clause he was reading referenced decision authority redistribution under specific public conditions, and as the phrasing entered the room, there was an almost immediate ripple of comprehension among those familiar with corporate governance, because the language was not symbolic but functional, and it suggested a reversal of expected control under circumstances that had just been triggered. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger but in recalibration, as if the foundation of his understanding of the ceremony was being reorganized in real time, and he looked up briefly toward Claire as though attempting to verify whether this interpretation aligned with her awareness. Claire met his gaze without hesitation, and in that exchange there was no performance, no attempt to soften or escalate, only alignment between two individuals who now understood that the structure surrounding them had always been more precise than it appeared. The officiant, still standing at a respectful distance, appeared uncertain whether to continue his role, because the ceremony itself had dissolved into something that no longer required traditional progression, and even the guests had begun to sense that they were no longer participants in a wedding, but witnesses to an unfolding legal revelation that carried implications far beyond the room. Ethan reached the midpoint of the final section and paused again, longer this time, and the silence that followed was no longer suspenseful in the traditional sense, but absorbing, as if the room itself had become a container for meaning that had exceeded its original capacity. When he continued, his voice was quieter, almost restrained, and the words he spoke confirmed what several in the audience had already begun to suspect, that the agreement governing this marriage contained conditional structures that redistributed control based on documented behavior within publicly observed scenarios, effectively linking private authority to public perception in a way that could alter executive influence under defined conditions. A subtle shift moved through the guests again, this time accompanied by visible reevaluation in expressions, as individuals recalculated what they thought they had been invited to witness, and whether their presence now positioned them as observers of ceremony or witnesses to contractual execution. Claire finally lowered her gaze slightly, not in submission but in reflection, as if acknowledging the final piece of a framework she had already understood in principle but had now seen confirmed through spoken interpretation. Ethan closed the document slowly without looking away from her, and the sound of the paper settling against itself felt disproportionately loud in the silence that followed, as though it marked the completion of something irreversible. He held it for a moment longer, then lowered his hand, and when he spoke again it was no longer to the audience but directed entirely toward Claire, his tone stripped of ceremony, stripped of performance, reduced to something closer to direct acknowledgement of position and consequence. Claire did not respond verbally, but her expression shifted subtly into something that suggested acceptance of structure rather than surprise at outcome, and that distinction changed the atmosphere in the room more than any spoken reaction could have. Around them, the guests remained frozen in a collective state of recalibration, aware that what they had assumed to be a ceremonial union had instead functioned as the public activation of a pre-existing agreement whose implications were now fully visible. Ethan's eyes remained on Claire, and for the first time since she had entered the ballroom, the dynamic between them no longer read as groom and bride, but as two parties standing within the final stage of a framework that had just completed its public transition from hidden structure to acknowledged reality, leaving the entire room suspended in a silence that no longer belonged to anticipation, but to understanding. The silence that had settled over the ballroom did not dissipate after Ethan Whitmore lowered the document. Instead, it transformed into something denser, almost architectural, as if the air itself had reorganized around the weight of what had just been revealed, and Claire Bennett stood at the center of it without movement. Her presence no longer interpreted through the lens of bride or participant, but through something far more structural, as though she had become the fixed point around which the entire understanding of the room had begun to rotate. Ethan remained facing her, the document now resting at his side, but his posture had subtly changed, not in confidence or control, but in recalibration, the kind that occurs when a system you believed you governed begins revealing rules you did not fully author. Around them, the guests remained frozen in a silence that no longer felt like anticipation but recognition, because the implications of what had been read were no longer abstract clauses, but active conditions that redefined everything they had assumed about the ceremony they were witnessing. A faint shift moved through the front rows as individuals adjusted their posture, some leaning forward as if proximity could clarify interpretation, others leaning back as if distance could soften impact. But no one spoke, because speech itself had become inadequate in a room where meaning was now being processed faster than language could contain it. Claire's gaze remained steady on Ethan, not searching for validation but waiting for alignment, because what had been exposed was no longer a question of surprise, but of confirmation between two people standing on opposite sides of a structure that had just completed its public transition from hidden agreement to acknowledged reality. Ethan finally broke the silence again, his voice lower now, stripped of any ceremonial residue, and what he said was not directed at the audience, but at the architecture of the moment itself, as though he was attempting to reconcile spoken reality with written framework. As he continued, the room absorbed each word with increasing intensity, because the language he was now articulating referenced operational thresholds tied to governance authority, conditional execution of control, and predefined redistribution of influence under publicly validated circumstances, transforming what had been perceived as a wedding into something that functioned more like a formal activation of contractual structure. A subtle ripple passed through the guests again, not audible, but visible in micro-movements of realization, as individuals who understood corporate language began to reframe what they were hearing not as narrative disruption, but as legal exposure occurring in real time. Claire did not react outwardly, but something in her stillness shifted in meaning, because she was no longer positioned as someone awaiting interpretation, but as someone whose awareness of the structure had already been complete before the room caught up. Ethan turned slightly toward the man in the dark suit who had delivered the document, and for a brief moment there was silent acknowledgement between them, not of secrecy, but of execution, as though both understood that the purpose of the document was never revelation but timing. The officiant remained motionless near the altar space, his role now undefined, because the framework that traditionally gave him function had been replaced by a system that required no ceremonial validation, only acknowledgement of terms already active. Ethan reached the final section of interpretation and paused again, longer than before, and in that pause the atmosphere of the room compressed further, as if collective attention had narrowed into a single point that could no longer expand. When he resumed, his tone carried a precision that removed all ambiguity, confirming that the agreement governing this union contained embedded conditions tied to observable public perception, conditions that directly influenced authority distribution within the defined partnership structure when activated under specific visibility parameters. The implication spread through the audience in layered realization, because it suggested that what they had assumed to be passive ceremony was in fact an active threshold event, one that redefined roles based on external observation rather than private intention. Claire's expression remained composed, but her eyes shifted briefly toward the document itself, not out of curiosity but confirmation, as though verifying that the spoken interpretation matched the internal structure she had already understood. Ethan lowered the paper slightly, and the simple motion felt like closure of a phase rather than conclusion of a reading, because the act of holding it no longer served interpretation but acknowledgement that the framework it represented had now been fully exposed in public domain. A quiet breath moved through the room collectively, not as sound but as recognition, because the guests now understood that they were not witnessing a disrupted wedding but the final stage of a controlled disclosure process embedded within a contractual system far more precise than any ceremonial expectation they had brought into the space. Ethan looked at Claire again, and this time the silence between them carried no uncertainty, only alignment within a structure that had shifted from theoretical to active, and in that moment the distinction between ceremony and contract dissolved completely, leaving only the reality of a framework that had just finished revealing its own boundaries under full observation. The room remained still, not because it was waiting, but because there was nothing left to anticipate within the logic of what had already been confirmed, and Claire Bennett stood at the center of it with absolute composure, not as someone caught in revelation, but as someone standing at the point where revelation had already completed its function. The ballroom remained locked in a state of suspended understanding, as though time itself had been recalibrated to accommodate the weight of what had just been confirmed, and Claire Bennett stood unmoving at the center of it, her presence no longer interpreted through the lens of ceremony, but through the far more rigid structure of defined conditions now fully exposed to public awareness. Ethan Whitmore held the final pages of the document at his side, no longer reading, no longer interpreting, because the act of reading had already completed its function, and what remained now was acknowledgement of a system that had shifted from concealed agreement to active visibility. The guests, once arranged in perfect ceremonial order, now existed in a quiet state of recalculation, their expressions subtly altered as they processed the implications of what had been spoken aloud, not as rumor or suggestion, but as formal structure embedded in legal language that had redefined the meaning of the moment they were witnessing. A faint movement passed through the audience, not disruptive but instinctive, as individuals adjusted their understanding of what authority meant in a space where ceremony and contract had converged into a single exposed framework. Claire's gaze remained forward, steady and controlled, but there was a new clarity in her stillness, because she was no longer positioned within the uncertainty of unfolding events, but within the certainty of established structure that had just been publicly validated. Ethan finally lowered the document completely, allowing it to rest at his side, and when he spoke again his voice carried none of the earlier ceremonial tone, only direct acknowledgement of what the document had already established, as though he was now translating structure into spoken clarity for everyone present who still required confirmation. The room responded not with sound but with attention, because every person present understood that what followed would not be symbolic or emotional, but procedural in nature, and that understanding alone created a silence more disciplined than anything that had preceded it. Claire finally shifted her gaze slightly, not away from Ethan but toward the space between them, and in that subtle movement there was no hesitation, Only recognition that the system they were standing within had completed its transition from hidden framework to activated condition. Ethan turned slightly toward the officiant, whose presence now felt secondary within a hierarchy that had been redefined in real time, and the lack of instruction given to him reinforced the realization that ceremonial authority had been fully superseded by contractual structure. The man in the dark suit remained at the edge of the space, still and observant, his role already complete, as if he had merely initiated a process whose consequences now belonged entirely to those within the room. Ethan exhaled slowly, and the sound of it was almost indistinguishable, yet in the silence it carried enough weight to signal that what remained was no longer discovery, but consequence. He looked back to Claire, and for the first time since the ceremony began, there was no ambiguity in the dynamic between them, because what had once been presented as union had now been fully reclassified as structured agreement operating under visible conditions. Claire's expression remained composed, but the stillness in her posture now read differently, not as emotional restraint, but as complete alignment with an understood system that no longer required explanation. Around them, the guests remained silent, their attention no longer shifting because there was nothing left to interpret beyond what had already been revealed. And in that collective stillness, the ballroom felt less like a ceremonial space and more like a chamber where a controlled disclosure had reached its final phase. Ethan held the silence for a moment longer, then spoke again, and this time his words did not add new information but confirmed the completion of interpretation, acknowledging that the conditions outlined within the document were now active in accordance with the circumstances present in the room. A subtle shift moved through the audience again, not in reaction but in realization, because the finality of his statement confirmed that nothing further would be revealed through escalation, only through consequence already embedded in the structure itself. Claire remained still as the last layer of acknowledgement settled across the room, and in that stillness there was no resistance, no surprise, only presence within a framework that had now fully transitioned from hidden agreement to public reality. Ethan finally lowered his gaze slightly, not in defeat but in recognition of completed transition, and for a brief moment the room existed in a silence that no longer held anticipation. Only the residual clarity of a system that had finished revealing itself under full observation, leaving Claire Bennett standing at its center as the only fixed point within a structure that had just become entirely visible. The silence that followed the final confirmation did not break in the way people expect silence to break. Instead, it unraveled slowly, as if the ballroom itself was unsure whether it was allowed to return to normal sound, and Claire Bennett remained at the center of that hesitation, unmoving, composed, and fully present within a reality that no longer required interpretation because every layer of the structure had already been revealed. Ethan Whitmore stood a few feet away, the document now lowered completely, his hand no longer holding it as a symbol of authority, but as a finished instrument whose purpose had already been executed in full view of every person present. The guests, once arranged in the quiet symmetry of a luxury ceremony, now existed in a different state entirely, their attention no longer collective but fragmented into individual reassessments, each person recalibrating what they believed they had witnessed against what had actually been disclosed. A faint shift passed through the front rows as someone adjusted their posture, then stopped mid-movement, realizing that even small gestures felt misplaced in a room that had transitioned from ceremonial space into structured exposure. Claire finally took a single step forward, not toward Ethan in reaction, but toward the center line of the altar space, and that movement alone altered the geometry of the moment, because it was no longer the groom or the ceremony defining the focal point, but her presence within a system that had now been fully acknowledged. Ethan's eyes followed her, not with surprise but with recognition, because whatever authority he believed he held within the structure had already been redistributed the moment the document was fully read aloud, and what remained now was alignment rather than command. The officiant, still present but functionally displaced, lowered his gaze slightly, aware that the role he had prepared to fulfill no longer existed in the framework that had just been publicly activated, and the absence of instruction left him suspended in a ceremonial position without ceremonial function. The man in the dark suit remained still near the edge of the space, his task complete, his presence now observational rather than active, as though he had delivered a mechanism into motion and stepped aside to witness its completion without further interference. Claire's eyes lifted slightly, not toward the audience but toward Ethan, and in that exchange there was no emotional escalation, only structural recognition, because both now understood that the system governing their positions had transitioned fully into its active state under public visibility. Ethan exhaled once more, slower this time, and when he spoke his voice carried a tone that no longer belonged to performance or ceremony, but to acknowledgement of finalized conditions, confirming that the framework outlined within the document was now in effect under the circumstances present in the room. A subtle ripple moved through the guests again, but it was no longer confusion that drove it, rather the quiet realization that they were witnessing not the disruption of a wedding but the completion of a controlled transition that had been designed to be observed. Claire's expression remained steady, but her posture now reflected something more defined than before, a sense of placement rather than uncertainty, as if she had stepped fully into the exact position the structure had always intended for her within this moment. Ethan turned slightly toward her, and for a brief instant the remaining distance between them felt less like emotional separation and more like defined jurisdiction within a system that had been fully exposed. The ballroom itself felt quieter than before, not because sound had decreased, but because meaning had consolidated, leaving no excess interpretation for the room to process. Guests no longer whispered, because whispering implied speculation, and speculation no longer had space within a framework that had already been defined in explicit terms. Claire took another step, slower this time, and as she moved, the perception of the room subtly shifted around her, because she was no longer being observed as a participant in ceremony, but as the central reference point of a structure that had just completed its public activation. Ethan's gaze remained fixed on her, and there was no longer uncertainty in it, only recognition that the dynamic they had entered into was no longer symbolic, but operational in nature, governed by conditions that had been fully disclosed and now fully applied. The officiant finally stepped back slightly, almost imperceptibly, signaling the end of any remaining expectation that traditional ceremony would resume, and that small movement confirmed what everyone in the room had already begun to accept, that the structure governing this moment had permanently shifted away from convention. Claire stopped at the center line of the space, and for the first time since entering the ballroom, she was not positioned within transition but within completion of understanding, standing at the exact point where interpretation was no longer required because the framework had already settled into its final visible form. Ethan lowered his head slightly, not in defeat, but in acknowledgement of final alignment within the system, and the silence that remained was no longer suspended anticipation, but settled comprehension, as the entire ballroom collectively recognized that what they had witnessed was not a ceremony interrupted, but a structure fully revealed and now fully in effect, with Claire Bennett standing as its fixed and undeniable center. The stillness that followed the full acknowledgement of the structure did not dissolve, but instead expanded, as though the ballroom itself had become larger in silence than it ever was in sound. And Claire Bennett stood at its exact center with an awareness that no longer required interpretation, because every remaining layer of uncertainty had already been removed by the spoken confirmation of conditions now fully active within the space. Ethan Whitmore remained a few steps away, the document no longer held with intent but resting at his side as a completed instrument, and yet his posture had not returned to anything resembling ceremonial presence, because what had just unfolded had repositioned him not as the center of authority, but as a participant within a system that had just declared itself in full visibility. Around them, the guests no longer shifted in collective reaction. Instead, they existed in fragmented stillness, each individual processing the same realization in different stages, some leaning slightly forward, as if proximity might clarify meaning, others frozen completely, as if movement might disturb the fragile structure of comprehension that had only just stabilized. A quiet breath moved through the front rows, not as sound but as awareness, because what they had witnessed was no longer interpretive theater but activated contractual reality, and that distinction alone altered the emotional temperature of the entire room. Claire finally turned her head slightly, not toward Ethan directly, but toward the space where the officiant still stood, and that small movement redefined attention across the ballroom, because it suggested that the focal point of authority had shifted again without announcement or permission. The officiant hesitated for a brief moment, then took a step backward, and that single retreat confirmed what everyone now understood without needing explanation, that the role of ceremony had ended before completion and had been replaced by something procedural in nature that no longer required symbolic progression. Ethan's eyes followed Claire again, but this time there was a subtle difference in how he observed her, not as groom or counterpart, but as someone whose position within the structure had just been fully validated through public exposure of conditions that governed both presence and authority. The man in the dark suit remained near the edge of the ballroom, still and composed, his function already completed, yet his presence now felt like a reminder that what had occurred was not spontaneous disruption, but controlled activation of pre-existing framework. A faint shift moved through the audience again as several guests instinctively checked their surroundings, not for escape, but for confirmation, because the realization that this structure had been active beneath the ceremony all along created a delayed awareness that reframed every prior moment within the event. Claire took a step forward, and this time the movement was not interpreted as reaction or hesitation, but as alignment with the center of a system that had now fully revealed its operational boundaries. And as she moved, the perception of the room adjusted around her as if gravity itself had redistributed attention. Ethan remained where he was, but his stance had subtly changed again, no longer positioned as initiator or controller, but as someone recalibrating within a framework that no longer required his direction to function, because the document he had read had already completed its procedural transformation into active condition. The guests remained silent, but their silence had evolved from anticipation into comprehension, because what they were witnessing was no longer unfolding narrative, but finalized structure being recognized in real time by those present within it. Claire reached the central axis of the altar space and stopped, and in that stillness there was no ambiguity left, because she was no longer positioned as participant within ceremony, but as reference point within system, and that distinction altered every remaining interpretation in the room. Ethan exhaled once more, and when he spoke it was not to continue explanation but to confirm state, acknowledging that the conditions outlined earlier were now fully in effect under public observation, and that acknowledgement did not create reaction but consolidation, because everyone present understood that the moment of change had already passed, and what remained was only the stabilization of its consequences. A subtle ripple passed through the guests again, but it was quieter than before, more controlled, because understanding had replaced speculation, and in that understanding there was no longer room for confusion, only recalibration of perception. Claire lifted her gaze slightly, and in doing so she met Ethan's eyes again, not as bride and groom, but as 2 points within a structure that had completed its transition from hidden agreement to exposed operation, and in that moment neither moved, because movement was no longer required for clarity to exist between them. The officiant lowered his hands completely, stepping fully away from the altar space, and that withdrawal marked the final dissolution of ceremonial expectation, leaving only procedural reality occupying the space they had once prepared for ritual. Ethan lowered the document fully now, allowing it to rest without intention, and the simple act signaled closure of interpretive phase, because nothing further remained to be disclosed through reading or explanation. Claire remained still at the center line, and the silence around her was no longer waiting, because waiting implied uncertainty, and uncertainty no longer existed within a framework that had already declared its own conditions in full view of everyone present. The guests no longer shifted or whispered, because even minimal sound felt incompatible with the precision of what had just been established, and instead they remained locked in observation of a system that had completed its activation without deviation. Ethan finally looked away from Claire for the first time in several moments, scanning the room briefly, as if acknowledging the broader implications of what had just become visible to everyone present, and when his gaze returned it carried no further expectation, only recognition that the structure had reached its final observable state. Claire's expression did not change, but her presence within the room now carried a different weight entirely, because she was no longer defined by role or expectation, but by position within a system that had just finished revealing itself under full public awareness. The ballroom remained suspended in that realization, not because something was still happening, but because everything that needed to happen had already occurred within the boundaries of the document that had been read aloud, leaving only the quiet, irreversible understanding that the structure governing this moment had fully transitioned into its final visible form, with Claire Bennett standing at its center as the only fixed point remaining. The silence that had settled across the ballroom did not collapse into relief or closure. Instead, it deepened into a sustained state of collective awareness, as if every individual present had unconsciously agreed that what they were witnessing no longer belonged to the category of ceremony, but to the category of finalized structure, and Claire Bennett remained at the center of it without movement. Her presence no longer interpreted through emotional expectation, but through positional certainty within a system that had already fully revealed its internal logic. Ethan Whitmore stood a few feet away, no longer holding the document in any meaningful sense of authority, but no longer needing to, because the function it served had already completed its transformation from hidden agreement to public condition, and what remained in his posture was not control, but recognition of recalibrated hierarchy. Around them, the guests no longer shifted with curiosity or speculation. Instead, they existed in a quiet stabilization phase, each person processing the same information at different speeds, some still visibly adjusting their understanding of what had just been spoken, others already beginning to accept that nothing further would alter the structure that had been revealed. A faint movement passed through the front rows again, not as reaction but as delayed comprehension, because the realization that this was not a disrupted wedding but an activated contractual system required time to settle into full understanding, and that understanding carried a weight that reduced even the smallest gestures into unnecessary motion. Claire finally turned her head slightly toward Ethan, and in that controlled movement there was no hesitation or emotional fluctuation, only alignment of awareness, because both now stood within the same defined framework that had been publicly confirmed and fully acknowledged by all present. Ethan met her gaze, and for the first time since the ceremony began there was no ambiguity in what passed between them, because whatever roles had once been assumed no longer applied in a space where conditions had already been executed in accordance with the document that had been read aloud in full view of witnesses. The officiant remained still near the edge of the altar space, his presence now functionally detached from the event itself, because ceremonial authority had already been superseded by structural activation, and his lack of action reflected not confusion, but recognition that procedural hierarchy had shifted beyond traditional form. The man in the dark suit remained at the periphery, motionless and observant, his role completed, yet his presence continued to serve as a silent reminder that what had occurred was not spontaneous disruption, but controlled initiation of a predefined system whose consequences were now unfolding in real time. Ethan exhaled slowly again, and the sound of it carried through the silence not as emotional release, but as acknowledgement of completion, because there was nothing left to interpret within the document, only conditions already in effect under full public observation. Claire took another step forward, and this time the movement was not contextualized by ceremony or reaction, but by structural positioning, because she was no longer approaching a moment of change, she was standing within the confirmed center of it, and every perception in the room adjusted subtly to that reality, without announcement or instruction. The guests remained silent, but their silence had evolved from suspense into recognition, because the information they had received no longer invited interpretation, only acceptance of operational framework that governed what they had witnessed from the beginning. Ethan lowered his gaze briefly toward the space between them, and in that moment there was a visible recalibration in his posture, not of emotion but of understanding, because the structure he had helped activate was no longer theoretical or conditional, it was fully present and now defining the parameters of every interaction within the room. Claire's expression remained unchanged, but her stillness now carried a different meaning entirely, because she was no longer positioned as participant within unfolding narrative, but as fixed reference point within completed system architecture, and that distinction shifted the entire perception of the ballroom around her. The officiant finally stepped back another half step, completing his withdrawal from ceremonial function, and that movement signaled the final dissolution of traditional roles within the space, leaving only structured awareness and confirmed conditions in place. Ethan turned slightly toward the audience for a brief moment, and the act itself carried no performative quality, only acknowledgement that the system had transitioned fully into its visible operational state under public observation. When he looked back at Claire, there was no remaining uncertainty, because the document had already done its work, and what remained was the reality it had defined, now existing without ambiguity or delay. The guests no longer shifted or reacted, because reaction required uncertainty, and uncertainty no longer existed in a room where every condition had been explicitly revealed and fully recognized by all present. Claire remained at the center line of the space, and in that position she was no longer interpreted through the lens of bride, participant, or subject of ceremony, but through the structural clarity of someone occupying the exact point where a system had completed its transition from hidden agreement to public execution. Ethan stood facing her, no longer separated by expectation or role definition, only by the final awareness that everything occurring within the room now operated under conditions that had already been fully disclosed, fully activated, and fully accepted by the reality of the moment itself, leaving the entire ballroom suspended in a settled silence that no longer belonged to anticipation, but to irreversible understanding. The ballroom did not return to normal sound, because there was no longer a normal state to return to, only a stabilized silence that had settled into the architecture of the room like a permanent layer of understanding, and Claire Bennett remained at the center of it without movement. Her presence no longer defined by expectation or narrative uncertainty, but by structural positioning within a system that had already completed its full public activation. Ethan Whitmore stood facing her, and the distance between them no longer carried symbolic meaning, because everything symbolic had already been translated into defined conditions through the document that had been read aloud and fully acknowledged by every person present. The guests remained frozen in a quiet state of recalibration, no longer reacting because reaction required discovery, and discovery had already concluded, leaving only recognition of what had been formally established in real time under full observation. A faint shift passed through the audience again, not as confusion, but as delayed comprehension settling into permanence, because the realization that this event had functioned as a controlled disclosure rather than a traditional ceremony required time to fully integrate into understanding. Claire finally moved again, taking a small step forward into the center line of the space, and that movement was no longer interpreted through emotional or ceremonial language, but through structural alignment, because she was no longer within the event as a participant, but within the system as its fixed reference point. Ethan's gaze followed her, and in that moment there was no remaining ambiguity between them, because whatever hierarchy had once been assumed had already been rewritten by the conditions that had been publicly confirmed and now existed as active structure within the room. The officiant remained at the edge of the altar space, his role now fully dissolved into irrelevance within the system that had replaced ceremonial progression with contractual activation, and his stillness reflected not hesitation but acknowledgement that no further function existed for him within the framework that had just been completed. The man in the dark suit remained motionless near the periphery, observing without participation, his presence now entirely residual, like the final trace of a mechanism that had already completed its intended operation. Ethan exhaled once more, and this time the sound carried a finality that did not require explanation, because everything that had been written, read, and spoken had already transitioned into effect under the full visibility of everyone present. Claire's expression remained composed, but her stillness now reflected completion of internal alignment, because she was no longer processing uncertainty, only acknowledging the finalized structure that defined her position within the system now fully exposed. Ethan lowered his gaze briefly toward the document still held at his side, and the gesture carried no further interpretive weight, because the document itself had already ceased to function as information and now existed only as confirmation of a system that had fully executed its transition from hidden agreement to public reality. The guests remained silent, but their silence had become absolute, not because of shock or anticipation, but because there was no longer anything left to interpret within the boundaries of what had already been revealed, and in that absence of interpretive space, the room stabilized into collective recognition. Claire stood still at the exact center line of the altar space, and the perception of the room adjusted around her once more, because she was no longer positioned within narrative sequence, but within structural completion, and every remaining awareness in the ballroom oriented itself around that fact without resistance. Ethan finally looked directly at her again, and this time there was no distance between interpretation and acknowledgement, because both now existed within the same finalized framework that had already been fully activated and publicly confirmed. The officiant lowered his head slightly, signaling the final withdrawal from any remaining ceremonial expectation, and that subtle movement marked the complete end of traditional function within the space, leaving only structured awareness and confirmed conditions governing the moment. Claire did not move again, because movement was no longer necessary to define position within a system that had already settled into its final visible state, and Ethan remained where he stood, not as authority or initiator, but as equal point of recognition within a structure that no longer required explanation. The ballroom itself remained unchanged physically, yet entirely transformed in perception, because what had once been a ceremony had fully transitioned into a completed disclosure event, and every person present now understood that nothing further would unfold beyond the conditions that had already been established, leaving only the quiet, irreversible certainty that the system governing this moment had fully completed its public activation, with Claire Bennett standing as its central and unmovable reference point. The silence that had settled across the ballroom no longer behaved like absence of sound, but like a completed state of understanding, as if every individual present had passed through the same invisible threshold of realization and emerged into a condition where interpretation was no longer required, only acknowledgement, and Claire Bennett remained at the center of that condition without movement, her presence defined not by emotional response or ceremonial expectation, but by the structural certainty of her position within a system that had already been fully activated and publicly confirmed. Ethan Whitmore stood facing her, and the distance between them no longer carried symbolic or emotional ambiguity, because every meaning that distance might have once held had already been absorbed into the framework that was now visible and stable within the room. Around them, the guests remained still, not in anticipation but in a form of collective recalibration that had replaced reaction entirely, because the realization of what had just occurred had already settled into permanence, leaving no further space for speculation or reinterpretation. A faint shift passed through the audience once more, but it was minimal, almost procedural in nature, as individuals adjusted posture or gazed not out of curiosity, but out of subconscious acknowledgement that the structure governing the moment had fully replaced the structure they had arrived expecting. Claire finally moved again, taking a measured step forward into the exact center line of the space, and that movement no longer functioned as narrative progression, but as confirmation of alignment within the system that now defined every visible relationship in the room. Ethan's eyes followed her without hesitation, and in that exchange there was no remaining uncertainty about roles, hierarchy, or expectation, because the document that had been read earlier had already completed its function of converting assumption into structure, and structure into active condition under full public observation. The officiant remained near the edge of the altar space, no longer attempting to engage or proceed with ceremonial function, because there was nothing left within the framework that required traditional progression, and his stillness reflected not confusion, but recognition of completed transition from ceremony to contractual activation. The man in the dark suit remained motionless at the periphery, observing without participation, his presence now entirely residual, like the final trace of an initiating mechanism that had already fulfilled its intended purpose and withdrawn from the operational center of the event. Ethan exhaled slowly, and the sound carried no emotional emphasis, only the finality of acknowledgement that nothing further remained to be revealed, because everything within the document had already transitioned into effect under the full visibility of the room. Claire's expression remained composed, but her stillness now reflected not restraint but completion of internal alignment, because she was no longer processing unfolding events, only existing within the finalized structure that defined her position with absolute clarity. Ethan lowered his gaze briefly toward the space between them, And in that small movement, there was no interpretive uncertainty, because the system they were both now standing within had already stabilized into its final visible configuration, and nothing within it required further activation or validation. The guests remained silent, but their silence had transformed into something absolute, no longer shaped by anticipation or uncertainty, but by full recognition that what they had witnessed was not disruption but completion of a controlled disclosure that had fully executed its intended function in real time. Claire stood at the exact center line of the altar space, and the perception of the room adjusted around her once again, because she was no longer positioned as participant within ceremony or subject of interpretation, but as the fixed structural reference point around which the entire system had resolved itself. Ethan remained where he was, and the distance between them no longer implied separation or tension, but equal positioning within a completed framework that no longer required explanation to sustain its validity. The officiant lowered his head slightly, and that subtle motion marked the final withdrawal from any remaining expectation of ceremonial function, signaling that traditional roles had fully dissolved within the space and had been replaced entirely by structural recognition. Claire did not move again, because movement was no longer relevant within a system that had already finalized its operational state, and Ethan remained still as well, not in opposition or alignment in emotional terms, but in shared acknowledgement of a framework that now governed their positions without ambiguity. The ballroom itself remained physically unchanged, yet the perception of everyone within it had permanently shifted, because what had once been understood as a wedding had fully transitioned into a completed disclosure event, and every person present now existed within the same settled awareness that nothing further would unfold beyond what had already been activated, leaving only the quiet, irreversible certainty that Claire Bennett stood as the central and unmovable point of a system that had fully revealed and completed itself under full public observation. The silence inside the ballroom no longer behaved like uncertainty or suspense. It had stabilized into something closer to institutional acknowledgement, as if the space itself had accepted the final configuration of events and was now operating under a new internal logic that no longer required interpretation, and Claire Bennett remained at the center of it without movement. Her presence no longer defined by transition or reaction, but by fixed structural placement within a system that had already completed its full activation in public view. Ethan Whitmore stood facing her, and for the first time since the document had been introduced, there was no visible effort to maintain or restore ceremony, because the ceremony no longer existed as a functioning layer within the room, having been fully replaced by the conditions that had been read, confirmed, and now executed through collective awareness. Around them, the guests remained still, but their stillness was no longer uniform in meaning, because the initial shock had already dissolved into a second phase of comprehension, where individuals were no longer processing what had happened, but what it meant in operational terms, and that shift created a different kind of silence, one that carried calculation rather than confusion. A faint movement passed through the front section again as several attendees subtly adjusted their posture, not out of discomfort, but out of recognition that their previous understanding of the event had been structurally incomplete, and that what they had witnessed was not disruption but completion of a controlled framework. Claire's gaze remained steady, and though her expression did not change, there was a visible clarity in her stillness now, because she was no longer positioned within unfolding uncertainty, but within fully defined conditions that had already been validated through public acknowledgement. Ethan finally lowered his eyes toward the document at his side, and this time the gesture carried no interpretive weight, because the document itself had already ceased to function as information and now existed only as confirmation of a completed system transition. The man in the dark suit remained at the edge of the ballroom, motionless and observant, his role entirely concluded, yet his presence continued to serve as a reminder that what had occurred was not spontaneous disruption, but structured activation of a predefined sequence that had now reached full visibility. The officiant stood slightly further back than before, his position now completely detached from ceremonial relevance, because the framework that once required his function had already been replaced by procedural reality that no longer depended on symbolic progression. Ethan exhaled slowly, and when he spoke again his voice carried a different quality, not explanatory and not ceremonial, but confirmatory, as if he was acknowledging the completion of a process rather than participating in its continuation. As those words settled across the room, the guests collectively shifted into a deeper layer of understanding, because what had been confirmed was no longer the existence of conditions, but their activation, and that distinction transformed the atmosphere from observation into recognition of consequence. Claire remained still, but her stillness now reflected not suspension but alignment, because she was no longer within the event as participant, but within the structure as its defining reference point, and every perception in the room subtly adjusted itself around that reality. Ethan looked up again, and for the first time there was no attempt to bridge or maintain relational framing between them, because the system they now occupied no longer recognized traditional roles as functional categories, only structural positions defined by executed conditions. A quiet ripple moved through the audience again, not as reaction but as recalibration, because individuals who understood the implications of contractual governance were now recognizing that what had been disclosed was not symbolic, but operational authority redistribution under publicly validated conditions. Several guests instinctively glanced toward each other, not in conversation but in confirmation, as if verifying that their interpretation aligned with the visible shift in structure that had just occurred within the room. Claire finally took another step, slower than before, and the movement was no longer perceived as progression through ceremony, but as stabilization within the central axis of a system that had now fully resolved its operational state around her position. Ethan did not follow her movement, but his attention remained fixed, because there was nothing left within the framework that required correction or escalation, only acknowledgement that the structure had fully transitioned into its active configuration. The officiant lowered his head slightly once more, and that subtle motion marked the final dissolution of any remaining ceremonial expectation, because the role he represented no longer existed within the operational environment of the room. The man in the dark suit shifted his stance almost imperceptibly, not as participation but as closure, confirming that his function as initiator or facilitator had reached completion and no further action was required. Ethan turned his head slightly toward the guests, and for the first time since the document had been introduced, the audience became fully aware of their own repositioning within the structure, because they were no longer witnesses to ceremony, but witnesses to executed framework under public observation. Claire remained at the center line, and in that position she was no longer interpreted through relational terms, but through structural finality, because every remaining variable in the system had already resolved around her presence. Ethan lowered his gaze again, and when he spoke this time it was not directed at interpretation or explanation, but at final acknowledgement of completion, confirming that the conditions established within the document had now fully transitioned into effect across all present parties under visible confirmation. A deeper silence followed, not because anything remained uncertain, but because nothing remained unaccounted for within the system, and that realization settled across the room with a weight that removed even the possibility of speculation. Claire did not move again, because movement was no longer required to establish position, and Ethan remained still as well, because his role within the structure had also been fully defined and concluded within the same system now governing the room. The ballroom itself remained physically unchanged, yet its perception had permanently shifted, because what had once been understood as a wedding had fully transitioned into a completed disclosure event with all conditions now active and acknowledged, leaving only the final state of understanding in place, where Claire Bennett stood as the central and unalterable point around which the entire structure had resolved itself into permanent visibility. The ballroom did not return to normal because there was no normal to return to, only a completed structural state that had replaced ceremony with fully visible consequence, and Claire Bennett remained at its center without movement, her presence no longer interpreted through narrative expectation but through absolute positional clarity within a system that had already finished executing its own conditions in public view. Ethan Whitmore stood a few steps away, and for the first time since the document had been introduced, there was nothing left in his posture that resembled control or performance, because the system they were standing within no longer required authority to function, only acknowledgement of what had already been finalized. Around them, The guests remained frozen in a silence that had evolved far beyond reaction, because what they were experiencing now was not surprise or confusion, but stabilization of understanding, as if each person had finally synchronized with the same realization that nothing further in this room would unfold beyond what had already been structurally completed. A faint shift moved through the audience, but it was no longer collective in nature, instead fragmented into individual moments of recognition, where each person adjusted their internal interpretation of the event to align with the irreversible clarity of what had been publicly confirmed. Claire finally turned her head slightly, not toward Ethan in emotional response, but toward the space ahead, and in that motion there was no uncertainty, only alignment with the central axis of a system that now defined every remaining perception within the room. Ethan lowered his gaze briefly, and in that gesture there was no remaining interpretive ambiguity, because the document that had once carried authority had already dissolved into consequence, and consequence now existed independently of its physical form. The officiant remained still at the edge of the altar space, his role no longer functionally or symbolically relevant, because the structure that had replaced ceremony required no continuation of traditional progression, only acknowledgement of completed activation. The man in the dark suit stood motionless near the periphery, his presence now entirely residual, as if he had served as the final initiating point of a system that had already completed its full transition into visible operation. Ethan exhaled once more, and the sound of it was no longer interpretive or emotional, but final in its simplicity, because there was nothing left within the framework that required explanation, expansion, or validation. Claire took another step forward into the center line of the space, and this movement was no longer perceived as progression through event structure, but as confirmation of final positioning within a system that had fully resolved itself around her presence. The perception of the room adjusted subtly again, because every remaining observer now understood that she was not within the ceremony as participant, but within the system as its defining reference point, and that distinction altered the entire meaning of what they had been witnessing from the beginning. Ethan remained facing her, but there was no longer relational interpretation attached to that orientation, only structural awareness that both were now positioned within a completed framework that no longer required interaction to define its state. The guests remained silent, but their silence had fully stabilized into comprehension, because the final ambiguity had already been removed through public confirmation of conditions, and nothing remained that could shift interpretation further. Claire stood completely still at the center line, and in that stillness there was no emotional reading available, because her presence had transitioned fully into structural finality, existing not as reaction to events, but as fixed point around which all remaining perception in the room now aligned. Ethan looked briefly across the audience, and in doing so acknowledged not participation but completion, because the room itself had ceased to function as ceremonial environment and now existed entirely as completed disclosure space under confirmed conditions. The officiant lowered his head slightly, marking the final dissolution of any remaining expectation of traditional role execution, and that motion signaled that ceremony had not been interrupted, but fully replaced by structural activation that required no further procedural continuity. Claire did not move again, because movement no longer held any functional relevance within a system that had already stabilized into final configuration, and Ethan also remained still, because every variable that once defined interaction between them had already been resolved within the completed framework now governing the room. A final subtle ripple passed through the audience, not as reaction but as closure of comprehension, because the last remaining interpretive space had been filled by confirmed structure, leaving no residual uncertainty within the environment. The ballroom itself remained physically unchanged, yet its meaning had fully transformed, because what had once been understood as ceremony had completed its transition into fully activated contractual disclosure, and every individual present now existed within the same stabilized awareness that no further event would occur beyond what had already been finalized. Claire Bennett remained at the center of it all without movement, not as participant in unfolding narrative, but as fixed structural reference point around which the entire system had fully resolved itself into permanent visibility.